Previously, I have made 3 separate videos covering the destruction of the Japanese aircraft carriers Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, and in those videos, a commenter brought to my attention a potential error in the history regarding the destruction of these 3 ships, and ever since then, I've decided to take a closer look at what the commenter suggested after holding a brief discussion with them regarding it. I'm sure, as most of you are familiar with, YouTube comments are most certainly not amongst the most reliable areas to get information from, but in this case, after handling the discussion with the commenter themselves, they had a large list of evidence to support their claims, and even since then, I have found further accounts that support their side of the story, going against the contemporary history that has been collected, and they root back to the book Shattered Sword. Prior to this commenter coming to the channel, I had never read Shattered Sword, and since then I have borrowed a copy and read it, taking emphasis on relevant points in the book, specifically Chapter 12, A Fallacious 5 Minutes, 1020 to 1025, which in the copy I have borrowed, it spans pages 229, 230, and 231. The purpose of this chapter is to quickly dispel a myth set up in the book Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, written by Mitsuo Fuchida, whom was on board Akagi during the battle. To summarize Fuchida's claim, he believed that if Akagi was given an additional 5 minutes prior to being bombed, the carrier could have successfully launched its attack strike, but Shattered Sword sets out to suggest that this account is completely fictitious, that Akagi was nowhere near ready to launch its strike wave. As a result, Shattered Sword also extends that Soryu, Hiru, and Kaga were in the exact same position as Akagi, meaning none of the 4 carriers were beginning to bring aircraft from their hangars to the flight deck. I also think it's worth mentioning at this point that Fuchida published another account with the assistance of another survivor from the battle, and that person was Masatake Okumaya, and in their combined account, they both contend that Akagi had a flight deck full of strike wave aircraft, and that the order to take off came at 10:24, so they contend that given an additional 10 minutes, Akagi would have had its strike wave off the deck. To get into Shattered Sword's arguments against strike wave aircraft being on the decks of the carriers, there are 2 key points: the final recovery times of fighter planes covering the carriers, and eyewitness accounts. Regarding the final recovery time of aircraft, Soryu recovered a plane at 9:50 a.m. Kaga followed at 10:05, and then finally Akagi with 2 fighters at 10:10. What's crucial about these times is that if aircraft are landing on the flight decks, it has to be kept clear at the after end, meaning no strike wave is being positioned or spotted on the after end of the flight deck, and this is true. Now, what I find interesting about this chapter in Shattered Sword is that it continues further by giving times regarding the launching of fighters, with Soryu given 2 times at 10 o'clock and 10:15, Hiru at 10:13, and Akagi at 10:25. My issue regarding the launching times of fighters is this has nothing to do with bringing aircraft up to the deck and spotting them at the after end, because the fighters do not take off from the after end of the flight deck. In each contemporary account, and in every photograph we have of the Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway, their fighters are positioned amidships ahead of the location where a strike wave would be spotted. Shattered Sword draws the unusual and unsupported conclusion that eyewitness accounts seeing aircraft at the after end of the carrier's flight decks must have just been groups of fighters getting ready to take off, but there's no source provided for that conclusion. I would actually argue that there is virtually no evidence from this battle, or any other battle that the Japanese carriers participated in, where the fighters were arranged at the extreme after end of the flight deck for takeoff. It was almost always exclusively amidships. Now, with regards to eyewitness accounts, this is a very slippery slope, especially in a case like this, where there are a lot that suggest one version of events, and a lot that suggest another version. But unfortunately, in this case, I can't say there's necessarily a lot that suggests that the Japanese carriers' flight decks were clear of the strike wave. There are three accounts that Shattered Sword uses to tear apart the idea the Japanese carriers had their strike wave being placed on deck. The first one was an interview done with Richard Best in April of 2000, where he suggested there were very few planes on board the flight deck of Akagi, which I fully agree with. The second account was given by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, and it was not his official account. It was actually the draft to his official report regarding the battle, and in the draft he said there were no aircraft on Sordu's flight deck whatsoever. The third and final account given in Shattered Sword was given by a torpedo bomber pilot from the Kaga, who said Kaga only had a couple of aircraft on the after end of the flight deck at the time the bombing occurred. Now, my problem with using eyewitness accounts to defeat eyewitness accounts is that it's a slippery slope that doesn't have a defined answer. For example, I'm going to use a famous subject, the sinking of the Titanic, where following the sinking of the ship, many eyewitnesses said it broke in half, many said it didn't, and history recorded until the wreck was discovered that the ship remained intact as it sank, but when Dr. Robert Ballard found it in the 1980s, it had indeed broken apart, which proved one side of the spectrum correct over the one that was believed to have been correct. In comparison to the three accounts given in Shattered Sword against the Japanese ships preparing strike waves on their flight decks, there is a large sum of eyewitness accounts that suggest they were preparing their strike waves, more than the two I have already suggested. Following the Second World War, the United States conducted a series of interrogations on several Japanese officials, and 4 regarded the Battle of Midway. Takahisa Amagi from the Kaga, Captain Aoki from the Akagi, Kawaguchi from Hiru, and Ohara from Soryu. Regarding Amagi's interview, he was asked, were planes on board the ship when it was hit? He answered, yes, about 30 in the hangar loaded and fueled, the remainder on the flight deck, 6 in the air. Captain Aoki's account is a little different. He was asked, were the Akagi's planes in the air? And he answered, about half of them were up attacking Midway, we were servicing the others in the hangar, about 40 on board, we had a high cover of 6 Zero-type fighters in addition. Now, as for Ohara aboard Soryu, he was interrogated twice, once in 1945 and once in 1946. During the interrogation in 1945, he did not mention the Soryu's condition regarding its aircraft at the time of bombing, but during the second interrogation, he stated that the strike wave was on the after end of Soryu's flight deck, awaiting further orders. Besides various interrogations conducted on Japanese prisoners following the Second World War, we also have the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet's report on the Battle of Midway, Task Force 16's after-action report, the Yorktown's after-action report, and VB-3's after-action report, all stating that the Japanese carriers had strike wave aircraft on their decks, along with a variety of accounts from the U.S. bomber pilots that suggested there were large amounts of aircraft concentrated on the after end of the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, with Paul Holmberg suggesting that he had dropped a bomb amidst 18 bombers spotted at the after end of Soryu's flight deck. I think I have demonstrated that using eyewitness accounts to counter eyewitness accounts is not the best method of dismantling a myth in this case. So, there is one more point during the battle that I wish to discuss that Shattered Sword seems to skim over, and this is the Hiru's counter-strike launch time being at 10:50, just about 20 minutes after the bombing of the first 3 carriers. Shattered Sword greatly emphasizes that it was impossible for the Japanese carriers to get aircraft from a hangar to the flight deck, spotted, warmed up, and launched within a short time frame, needing at least 45 minutes to complete the whole operation. And this, for the most part, is correct. There could be some discrepancies in the time, depending on mechanical failures and unexpected errors. So, assuming there were no breakdowns aboard Hiru, Shattered Sword suggests that the aircraft have to go from the hangar to the flight deck and then launched, all within a 20 to 25 minute time span, which that time is closely resembled to the argument against Akagi in the book being 15 minutes, where the authors of Shattered Sword outright say it's impossible to complete the operation in that given time. Yet, an exception for some reason is made for Hiru. Hiru's counterstrike consisted of anywhere from 21 to 24 aircraft, depending on which source you read, but regardless of what number this is, it's most definitely impossible for that number of aircraft to go from the hangars to launching in a 20-minute time frame. So this means, in the case of Hiru, it most certainly had to have begun taking aircraft from the hangars to the flight deck before the first 3 ships were bombed. This is actually supported by Admiral Nagumo in his after-action report, where he says that Akagi and Kaga's strike waves were to be ready for launch by 10:30 and Soryu and Hiru between 10:30 and 11. Given that Kaga last landed aircraft at 10:05, it is entirely possible that aircraft were being taken from the hangars to the flight deck in the 20-minute window before being bombed. In the case of Soryu having last landed aircraft at 9:50, it's even more probable that the aircraft were not just taken from the hangar to the flight deck, but even possible that spotting had begun. This actually lines up with Hiru because based on the time scale, the average time that Hiru needed to start getting its aircraft on the flight deck was 10:05, which is when Kaga last landed aircraft. I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, but emphasis needs to be placed on this timetable, as Shattered Sword suggests it was too tight for aircraft to be taken from the hangars to the flight deck, where in reality, it was not. What I do agree with in Shattered Sword is that Akagi in specific was nowhere near ready for launching aircraft, probably needing an additional 30 minutes, which is where Fuchida's account is wrong. But just because Fuchida is wrong about Akagi does not mean his account applies to Kaga, Soryu, or Hiru. Those are completely different ships that he had nothing to do with. So to wrap up this video, I wanted to say that Shattered Sword overall appears to be an excellent work, though it's not completely definitive as everybody seems to think it is, as I do believe that there are points in the book that can be contended using extensive amounts of primary sourcing. Given all of the available evidence, with the exception of Akagi, I think it's entirely possible that Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru had begun the process of raising their aircraft from the elevators to the flight deck, and for the most part, had the bulk of their strike waves stationed on the flight deck preparing for spotting and warming up. But I also need to emphasize that this does not take away from the causes of the ship's destruction. The aircraft, whether they were inside the hangars or on the flight deck, were still fully fueled and armed, and would explode when a bomb aggravated those aircraft, not to mention there was still ordnance laying around the hangars, not stored away, which would also explode. So, the ultimate destruction of the ships is not changed regardless of where we place the strike wave aircraft. With that having been said, that is all I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.